Welcome to Threat Intelligence View of IP Addresses. This is an apprentice level course and we'll be covering a couple of very basic tidbits of information about IP addresses and how threat intelligence views them. In a nutshell, your IP address, which is short for Internet Protocol Address, is how you're identified when you go on the internet. It is literally your address. And I've got an example here on the side for you. Every device that connects to the internet is given a number. It doesn't matter what it is, desktop, laptop, mobile, tablet, your phone, everything's going to get an IP address. There's some complexity to that, but they're less important than introducing the fact that everything has an IP address when it's on the internet. And as you can see in here in my example on the right, your laptop here has an address, and we've got a made-up address of 172.172.136.47. Now, the purpose of the IP address is really to identify the sender and receiver of information in an HTTP protocol. Effectively, that's a simple way to say it identifies you when you take actions or perform behavior on the internet. Your IP address, which identifies you, just like your address identifies your home, is an indicative of you. So when you're performing things as that IP address, it is recording behavior in HTTP protocols. Really, that's probably more complicated than this needs, but just understand that everything on the internet, whether it's you or someone else, has an IP address. My example here, this is a laptop going to a website. Websites have an IP address. Even though we type in familiar and fun names as a domain, the reality is the internet only cares about the IP address that is behind that. And that's how it identifies things. And we use that a lot in threat intelligence. But before I get too far into that, there's two basic versions, version 4, version 6. Version 4 is about 32 bits long. Actually, it's exactly 32 bits long and expressed as a number. Then there's an example here on the right, the same one that I gave earlier. Key things to remember is it always will be 4 octets. They will have 0 to 55 as far as numbers, so you won't have a 256 or 760 something. It will literally be between 0 to 255. There are some parts of IP addresses that are reserved and things like that. We'll cover that in a separate lecture. Now, IPv6 is a little different. There's a lot of reasons why we went from version 4 to version 6, but it can really be summarized as version 4 just didn't have enough IP addresses. No one, when the internet was first conceived, thought that we would use up all the version 4 IP addresses that were there. So they were much surprised when it became very popular, I guess, and then they needed more IP version addresses to identify people because we rapidly ran out. That's where version 6 came from. Don't ask me about version 5 because I have no idea what happened to it. But IPv6 gives us basically an endless number of addresses to use. And it's pretty simply that. You can have more than one IP, just as a note. You can have 5 or 6, 10, it doesn't matter. There's no real limit. And you can have both version 4 and version 6 IPs concurrently assigned. How do we use IP addresses as threat intelligence? We do primarily use them to identify devices, to understand that's a server or a laptop or something of that nature, and also to identify behavior. Because that IP address is basically your identity on the internet, what it does is your behavior, and it can be tracked that way. That's where that HTTP protocols, identification comes into. And lastly, again, this is kind of an apprentice level introduction, so very, very basic. There's 2 tasks primarily that happen in relation to IP addresses that apprentices are asked to do. One of them is a basic IP address lookup, which you'll do some very straightforward data collection. We'll perform that here shortly. And the other one is identifying what an IP address is, what it represents. Mainly that means breaking it down into its type, who owns it, and what kind of basic behavior and role is it playing. So an IP address that's assigned to a name server, which is a part of the domain name system that actually resolves a domain name to an IP, will have its own IP address, and that could be its role and its behavior. And it might be owned by your internet service provider or could be owned internally by your company. Those are things that you might determine in that IP address identification. So more to come. Let's get into some tasks. Welcome back. I had to do a short pause there to jump over to my virtual machine. All right, I've outlined the tasks we just introduced in the slide deck here on the right there. I misspelled look, so we'll just fix that real quick. So we're going to look up an IP address, the one thing we talked about, some basic information. And some basic information might be the IP address itself, its CIDR or its route, and then, of course, what ASN, asynchronous number it belongs to. Those are very important items. You can collect more, but these are kind of your basic minimums. And you can already see behind the scenes a couple of websites that I've pre-set up we're going to take a random IP address and we're going to go through these, and I'm going to show you how to fill this out. So let's start with basic information. Now you can pretty much go anywhere you want, but I like ipinfo.io because it gives me exactly what I'm looking for very quickly. And a lot of that is here in this JSON format that is provided. Now I just pulled a random IP out, and this particular one happens to belong to a Thai IP. Or I'm sorry, it's related to a Thai country. You can see that here where it gives us the country code TH. So if that was important, if you were geo-blocking IP addresses, which is a way to say you don't want anything that's not coming from certain countries, or you only want information coming from certain countries, you could block IP addresses that way. So we might write that down. So in this case, if I was filling out our example, I want to stick to my basics. So I'm going to take, this is my IP address, 4949.132.16. As you can see here, it has a host name. This will be covered in a different lecture. What we care about is what's the route. So let's go ahead and go down that. So you can see there's a lot of good information in here that you could collect, but we really want to get into the route. And here's our route right there. You may also look at that in a different way. Some people call this a CIDR, which is an old reference, or a net range. Really, it's meant to represent a cluster of IP addresses and how they are taken care of to move information to and from them on the internet. If you remember that much, you've got the basics down. So that would be the route. Now in here, you'll see this is the AS number. Now it kindly starts out with the letters A and S, which makes it a little easy. And you kind of get this couple digits afterwards. In this case of 45,629. Typically, I will grab that, and I will also grab the name. Because just like with domains, this tends to be a more familiar, comfortable thing for people to look at. So this is the JASTEL Network International Gateway. And we don't really know what that means yet, but that's what we know so far. Now it's going to give you something that's part of the next piece, but I'll go ahead and jump on it right now. Anyway, you'll see here it says type ISP. And that's going to become important when we talk down here, because we're going to write that down already. So when you identify a IP address, you want to kind of identify its behavior and its purpose. So there's a lot of ways to do this, but we're going to chiefly look at some of the most important things. An IP address that is meant for residential should have certain behaviors. It should match residential persons' behaviors. It should not be doing things that a corporate environment should do. Potentially shouldn't be doing millions of calls to an API, for example, or hitting your form 300,000 times. Those are unorthodox behaviors for that kind of IP. An ISP IP, however, could be a lot of things. It could be a commercial entity, an organization, a government entity, military, a university. There's a list of things it could be. And so it's a little broader. But what it shouldn't look like is a person. It should not resemble a person's activity. So I shouldn't see residential type behavior coming from an ISP-like IP. So I shouldn't see that, for example, access a healthcare form. That would be something unusual for that kind of IP address. Now, ownership is kind of what we're talking about here, where it says, you'll see company here. This is T Internet Company Limited. We'll go ahead and grab that. And they give their domain, which I'm not going to grab, but you could always do so. Essentially, this is the ISP that owns that particular IP address. And you'll see that there can be a big difference between the owner and the asynchronous number identifier. And that's important because sometimes large companies will own or lease a large chunk of IP addresses, and they'll actually be recognized by the AS as being the owner. But more often, there will be a top-level owner who will lease out chunks of IP addresses to smaller companies, and they will subdivide however many IP addresses they own. And that's what we're doing here. So this T Internet Company Limited is probably acting as an ISP and doing things that you're familiar with, and they have leased their IP ranges from this particular company, this AS. And the basic behavior that we expect here is an ISP. Now we will enhance that a little bit because we're going to look at it in a few other ways as well. But you can grab a couple of really good information sources, good information items from here really quickly, including whether it's acting in these kind of roles, such as a VPN proxy or having Tor or hosting. If this again was a residential space, you would not expect to see this kind of activity. Now, the fact that this is an ISP, this could be false or true, and it might not necessarily matter. It could be any of those, and that would be fine. Another key thing to note is this IP is not hosting anything. So it is not hosting a website, which is important. If I saw that kind of behavior from it, so let's go and look at this in a different tool. So again, this is ipinfo.io, and I'll put this down in the description. Another tool that I like for this kind of research is Hurricane Electric. They have what they call a looking glass, which allows you to look up a lot of good information about IP addresses and dig into the weeds and understand how they're being routed. We're only going to lightly touch on this because as an apprentice, as someone new, you need to know enough to be able to look up the information you need, and you can then kind of branch out of there more, and especially as you gain familiarity with the career field. So here's the same IP address that I had just shown you, 49.49.132.16. As you can see here, it might be a little confusing, and this was random, but it's actually a great example because if you look here, you'll see 4 routes. And I know that can be confusing when you first come across this, and when you come across it and you're like, why isn't there one route? Well, routing is a very important concept in internet theory. Without going too deep in the weeds, how something is routed is very important because it tells the computers on the internet how they're going to get to their location and how the traffic they're trying to send or receive is going to get back. In this case, there are 4 current announcements by 2 different ASs. As you can see here, here's our 45758, and here's another one of 45629, and they're announcing both of them for a /16 and a /17. Now, CIDR nomenclature, just to touch on it, is a series of numbers with a slash from either 32 down to basically 12, I guess you could see, but rarely do you see something underneath a 16. It's possible, but it's very unlikely. You can see them. It actually goes all the way down farther, but for our purposes, if you start seeing large groups of IP addresses that are smaller than 16, you have a lot of IPs to juggle. And you'll want to refine that down because it's definitely broken down. It's subbed out, definitely. So in this case, there's a /16, and there's a whole way to figure that out, and I'll save that for another lecture. Just know that you would record that all 4 routes are valid. And you'll know that because if you look here, it'll tell you that the route is signed invalid. It is actually valid. And you can look up some details on this. You can get its whois, which we'll skip because there's not much value there since they made changes with GDPR. You can tell, it tells you what it resolves to, which is useful. And then it kind of gives you some, these are black hole lists. So it tells you that it's on 2 of them, but it's 2 out of 93. So that's not really all that relevant. The key thing is you could click on these. So let's click on this one here. And you'll see that it goes into, when you look at just the route, it's like, hey, this route is owned by 2 different ASs and they're both delegating, they're both handling it. And each one will tell you what DNS is in there. So if you recall, we looked at 132.16. Now, Hurricane Electric only lets you look at so many. You can see here it started with a 0, so there's no chance that we're going to be able to see it. But you can see the kind of information that's in there. So this is either a data center or something similar, and there's some further techniques to refine that. That's really beyond but apprentice level. But you would look at this and say, okay, this is an ISP or a data center, and its behavior is that it's routing basic things. It's not hosting, it's not a part page, it's not acting as a proxy, it's not a VPN, and so on. It's very, very straightforward. And you could further reinforce that by going to VirusTotal, and you can see I've already loaded it up. I'm going to copy this real quick, go to the front page of VirusTotal. This will be one of your best friends in threat intelligence. You'll figure out a lot about the domain name system, DNS, and files from VirusTotal. It's best to search first as a reminder, and you can see there, I'll delete this real quick. It tells you kind of right off the bat, you can look at a URL, an IP address, a domain, or a file hash. We're going to give it an IP address, and we're going to see what they say. And they're going to come back and say, okay, that IP is in this route. And you're going to see, well, wait a minute, I thought it was a /16 or /17. Why are they saying it's a /15? Depending on the time this was ran, it could have been in a /15 at that point. These things change. They are dynamic. So as they lease out and reclaim IP addresses from customers, they may route for a larger or smaller amount of IP addresses. And that's all that represents, this route here. A /15 is a pretty good sized one. And again, you can see that it's recognized as Jastel Network International Gateway. which is what we expected. And you can dig into details. They'll give you who is, like sort of what we just saw, and then you'll get relations and so on. If there's community information, you'll get it. You can get a lot of great information out of VirusTotal. I'm just going to focus on this part about IP addresses. Now, a note, if it had relationships to malware, phishing, bad emails, negative information, or positive, it would start showing up here in relationships as it said, oh, this IP in the past had resolved for this domain, or it was connected to this malicious file. So this is a very good stop to make. And if it had, you would enter that kind of information here. Now, kind of a last one is Spur. And I'm only going to give you a few tools to keep it simple in the beginning here, but I like Spur because it gives me additional context. And this goes back to what is it doing? Now, we know it's an ISP IP. We can add on from Spur that, hey, some context here is it is not being used for anonymous activity. There's not a lot of devices that use this IP, right? Their data, you know, they don't see many associations with it, right? And these are key things. It's not being used in an anonymous fashion, so it's not being used as a proxy or something else. And there's very small number of devices. A low device count is good because it shows that it's probably being used the way it's supposed to be. So a couple of key things, you would fill that in. We can do another IP address. Let's see here. Let's pick another one. We'll get something random, 132, 132. Oh, let's just do all 132s. And we can see here, this is Sierra Vista in Arizona. So you can get your good information here. It flat out tells you this is a Department of Defense network. So this is not necessarily a great network. So if you were looking at this particular IP address, it is a DoD, US DoD, Department of Defense Network Information Center IP. In this particular AS, here's its route. And as you can see, it's not showing any of the negative things that we are happy to see. And if you come down here, it even tells you that it's DISA and that it's coming out of Ohio. That's always fun because they kind of give away who they are. And it's not particularly hosting anything. And you would do the same thing if you were doing a lookup on this one and carry your checks through. Go to Hurricane Electric. It tells you that, hey, here it is. We get some more verification. There's the /16. You don't see the green thing, so it does not have a signed ROA. It does not necessarily define. That's because it has primarily .mil information in it. And you'll see here you might have an announcement and then a less specific announcement. This is a very broad. So again, the smaller the number, the bigger the amount of IPs there. And this is very specific. And you could get into DNS and so on like we had done before. But I'm going to keep carrying over my IP. Here we are looking at it in VirusTotal. And again, we get more information. Ooh, we get a /13 this time. They're going big. Any details if we wanted them, relationships. This time you have relationship information that you can see. You can see that this particular IP has in the past hosted some really interesting domains. You can kind of expand that out and get more of those. You can even see that it had a relationship to malware on May 17th in 2020 and kind of go on and see what's there. We'll carry it over to Spur just to finish our process. And here we go. Same kind of thing, not a lot of anonymous activity, very few devices. And of course, here is our AS306 again. So it's just some basic examples. If you were an apprentice and you were asked to do a lookup, you would record your basic information plus anything else they ask you to do. So if they say, no, the city is really important, make sure you annotate the city, you would note that. You know, if there's other things in here like, hey, no, I want to know, more. I want to know these 4 things. I want to know some address information, right? All that's pulled from whois. That's where that comes from. Geolocations like this one are okay, but they're very, very erroneous. Most of the times they're off significantly. You cannot match IP to device very well and match geolocations too. In some cases where there's a GPS on that device, like a phone, and it's streaming out an IP and GPS information and has specific behavior and it's in a restricted network, you can kind of get much, much more accurate. But a server sitting somewhere in Arizona could easily be servicing somebody in Russia or over in Israel as easily as it could be serving somebody on that IP next door. So it kind of varies quite a bit. So that's the end here. Just a short walkthrough to To kind of touch on a few very important basic concepts, I'll be doing more of these and we'll touch on more of them. I'm trying to keep them short as we touch on things piece by piece.